So in our trip through John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, we're on Chapter 3 of the State of War, and Locke wants to contrast the state of nature, which he's already described, which is a state in which people are without any sort of government or overarching power to control them, and the state of war. Now, Thomas Hobbes had said that people in a state of nature are always also in a state of war because there is so much fear and suspicion amongst people who cannot read each other's minds and do not know what's coming next, that they will always be on their guard and they will try to preempt violence with violence. But Locke disagrees. That's a big difference, and it's a difference that sets up his theory for classical liberalism. That difference is that Locke thinks that in the state of nature, it is quite possible for people to obey, follow the natural law most of the time. So the state of nature can be a time when people may live somewhat precariously, but can defend themselves and can execute the natural law themselves. And as we learned last time, the only problem with that is that people are often biased and aren't good judges and can easily go too far when becoming judge, jury, and executioner of the natural law. And it's this going too far which turns things towards a state of war. Now, it's interesting that Locke says that the state of war can happen in the state of nature, but it can also happen in civil society, because what the state of war is when somebody tries to take away the freedom of somebody or a group of people, somebody else. That's why he says that it's lawful for a man to kill a thief who has not in the least hurt him nor declared any design upon his life, because you can, even in civil society, anticipate that somebody who would go about stealing your money might take your life as well. And something that threatens your life can be met with lethal force. So that's why he can conclude, men living together according to reason, without a common superior on earth, with authority to judge between them, is properly the state of nature. But force, or declared design of force, upon the person of another, where there is no common superior on earth to appeal to for relief, is the state of war. And even in civil society, when you are met with a thief, you are, in relation to that thief, in a sort of micro state of nature. If there's nobody around to protect you from that thief, though that thief be in your own home in the middle of a big city, you are in the state of nature relative to that person at that time. So he says, want of a common judge with authority puts all men in a state of nature. Force without right upon a man's person makes a state of war, both where there is and is not a common judge. So I guess you could say Locke is all for self-defense, and he would not take kindly, I suppose, to any notion that a person doesn't have that right in civil society, even if it means potentially killing the thief that comes and tries to break into your home. When things come to a state of war, there is no security whatsoever, and so Locke very much wants to emphasize that the goal is to avoid this. He says to avoid this state of war is one of the great reasons of men's putting themselves into society and quitting the state of nature, for where there is an authority, a power on earth, from which relief can be had by appeal, there the continuance of state of war is excluded, and the controversy is decided by that power. Now, that sounds a little bit like the solution of Thomas Hobbes, but the difference is going to be that Locke believes that peace should not be had at any price, you might say. Hobbes basically was willing to accept an absolute monarch, and one that could be seen as quite tyrannical. because in Hobbes's mind there wasn't anything worse than the state of nature, because it was always a state of war. Locke, on the other hand, thinks that one thing worse than the state of nature is an absolute monarch, because that absolute monarch can take your life whenever he wants to and be in a state of war with the citizens. And so Locke reasons that it's better to be in the state of nature with all of its risks. It is quite livable most of the time in his view. It is not an instantaneous state of war, and it's better to endure that than to put yourself into the hands of an all-powerful sovereign who can take away your life whenever it wants to. So then in the next chapter 4, which is entitled Of Slavery, he says that the liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the Commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what the legislative shall enact, according to the trust put in it. He insists, therefore, that a person cannot willingly consent to slavery. And that's exactly what he thinks people are doing if they buy into the Hobbesian notion of the social contract. They're enslaving themselves. They're putting themselves into the hands of an absolute sovereign who could be a tyrant and from which they could not defend themselves. He goes so far as to say a person cannot take away his own life. Okay? Again, this sounds like he's making an argument against suicide, and he probably is, but what he really has in mind, the real purpose of that statement, that no one can take his own life because it wasn't his to take, since he's made by God. The point of that is to say you cannot enslave yourself. You cannot put yourself into the hands of somebody who could take your life from you. But you could if you had a right to kill yourself. If you establish that you have a right to kill yourself, then why wouldn't you also have a right to put yourself into the hands of an enslaver who might kill you? You see, he has to make that argument that you don't have a right to take your own life. He defines slavery as a state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Slavery in a tyrannical state, the type of slavery the person living under a tyrannical state experiences, is really a state of war. Now, when he says that, he's setting you up for this notion that such a person still has this right to defend himself, as we all do in the state of war, has a right, he will argue later, to rebel. Now, the next chapter is on property, and this gets really interesting. He starts out sounding like, I mentioned before, he sounds like he might be the type of Christian who thinks we should all just share and become communal, but he doesn't end up there. At the start, though, he says, God, who has given the world to men in common, has also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. So God gave the world to human beings, but you see even here that there's a bias or a bent towards usefulness. So he says, though all the fruits of it naturally produces, the fruits it naturally produces and beasts it feeds belong to mankind in common, as they're produced by the spontaneous hand of nature, and nobody has originally a private dominion exclusive of the rest of mankind in any of them, as they are thus in their natural state, yet being given for the use of men, there must be of necessity a means to appropriate them some way or the other. Now, what he does next is very interesting. He says that if a person in nature, in the state of nature, goes about and mixes his body with the things of the earth through his labor, basically, through the labor of his own body, he picks up nuts off the ground or apples from the tree, or he slays a rabbit, then this makes it his property. So it's very important to note, he establishes the right to property in the state of nature. Property is not, for Locke, a product of the social contract. But as soon as we mix our labor with the things of the earth, whatever we produce becomes ours. If we haven't mixed our labor with it, it can become anybody else's. Everything's kind of up for grabs. He says if you're concerned about that maybe everything will be more or less grabbed up, he says God has made the world a very big place, and there's no scarcity that he can foresee, and so there always will be enough for you someplace else. If you encounter a little plot of land that's been enclosed, it'd probably be pretty little. But if you find like a basket of apples that somebody else has taken and you need to move on, well, just move on to the next apple tree. Problem solved. But then he introduces a limitation. He says, in the state of nature, we have been given the things of the earth by God to mix with our labor and make our property, but only up to the point that we can actually use them. Now, in the state of nature, it's more or less every individual for themselves. I think he envisions, a sort of rudimentary family and some cooperation, but ultimately, it might boil down to what the individual or maybe 2 or 3 people can, in cooperation, collect and secure for themselves, and that's pretty small. And then you've got the problem of spoilage. No fridges back then, right? No security guards either. So basically, it didn't make any sense. It's against the law of nature, so to speak, to gather up way more acorns than you can possibly either use before they go bad, or that you could possibly protect from others who need them. He says nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. So there's the law against spoilage. But then he says, yes, God gave the world to men in common, but he gave it to the use of the industrious and the rational. Okay, and this is where the reasoning starts to take a little turn. It's not all warm fuzzies and kumbayas in the state of nature at this point. As we start talking more about property and possessions, we get to the point fairly early on, still in the state of nature, when money is invented, which gets around the problem of spoilage. Okay, I'll try to explain how that happens. He starts to take the turn here. He says, I dare boldly affirm that the same rule of propriety, that every man should have as much as he could make use of, would still hold in the world without straitening anybody, that is, without harming anybody. Since there is land enough in the world to suffice double the inhabitants, had not the invention of money and the tacit agreement of men to put a value on it introduced by consent larger possessions and a right to them. Okay? Now, again, we will explain how this all happens, but I just want to lay emphasis on the fact that the invention of money also is happening in the state of nature. And so within the state of nature, before civil society, you get the concept of property, you get money, and now next we're going to see, because of money, the expansion of property beyond what an individual or small group can either consume or protect. Locke tells us that the general effect of money and the expansion of property has been good. He says the provisions serving to support of human life produced by 1 acre of enclosed and cultivated land are 10 times more than that which are yielded by an acre of land of equal richness lying waste in common. Now imagine we're going from hunting and gathering, basically, to cultivating. And so really what he's saying is when we get to the point of cultivating, farming, doing farming, cultivating the land in that way, that it came with the invention of money. We couldn't do that without the invention of money, because to even have 1 acre, you have to be able to have enough people to work it. More importantly, in this case, you need enough people to protect it. You need to have a posse, so to speak, to protect your small farm. Where are you going to get that posse? They're not working for free. Money facilitates hiring people for labor. And as these enterprises expand, even in nature, I think there's a intimation of exactly that, hired labor. Again, he says, I think it will be but a very modest computation to say that of the products of the earth useful to the life of man, 9/10 are the effect of labor. He says, what in them is purely owing to nature and what to labor, we shall find that in most of them 99/100ths are wholly to be put on the account of labor. Now, I just want to stop and assess for a moment the implications for the relationship between God and man here. We started out with God giving everybody this beautiful, wonderful nature in common, and now we find out that the nature is kind of a waste. In the olden days of hunter-gatherers, when people just kind of roamed around looking for enough food to eat, that is said to be a waste of a situation. When it comes to the point where money is invented and we can expand and enclose more land and we can cultivate it intensively, we can actually create 99/100ths of the, or 99% of the value of that land. So human labor has created the vast majority of the value of that land. And I just want to point out that in effect, Locke is arguing that human beings and not God give God's creation most of its usefulness and value. Okay? That is a sort of impious thought. It certainly is a challenging thought. It's it's an aspect of Enlightenment thought that mankind is raised to a level of greater competence and greater importance relative to God and God's creation than he ever was during the Middle Ages. And just to make his point abundantly clear, he then refers to the Native Americans, who at his time people knew about and understood something about how they lived. He says they're rich in land and poor in all the comforts of life, whom nature having furnished as liberally as any other people with the materials of plenty, yet for want of improving it by labor, have not 1/100th part of the conveniences we enjoy. And a king of a large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England. So by that he's saying a chieftain, a Native American chieftain, is worse off than a day laborer in England. Well, it's interesting, Alexis de Tocqueville, writing in the mid-19th century, when the settlement of America by Europeans had been going on for a long time, was there, witnessing the pushing back and driving out of Native American tribes as the Europeans moved westward. And he was able to observe the attitude of many Native Americans. Now, on the one hand, he was very sympathetic to their misery, to many of these tribes who, were decimated and who were displaced and were driven hither and yon, trying to find a place where they could settle down. But also, he observed that the Native Americans, living in places where they were comfortable, but within some proximity of white settlers, looked over the fence, so to speak, and Tocqueville said they had an aristocratic attitude relative to the sort of bourgeois attitude of the settlers. They looked over and they thought, why do they work so hard? They toil from sunup to sundown, and they don't seem to have any enjoyment in life. And sure, they have this structure, but they can't. But it also enslaves them. It keeps them from going wherever they want to go. The main thing that he seemed to pick up on was a disdain for hard, grueling manual labor. The Native Americans thought of it as slavish, and so there was this culture clash in which the settlers looked at the Native Americans as, why don't you want to get with the program? Almost lazy. And the Native Americans looking at the settlers like they were crazy. So I guess, we have to say Locke is displaying the settler mentality, but an aristocratic mentality would, in Europe, thought the same of the Lockean point of view. In other words, there were people during and after the Enlightenment who reacted to this type of thinking much the same way that the Native Americans did. These people were the aristocratic class, trying to gain some coin by working all day long was not in their playbook either. The great art of government, Locke says, is the increase of lands and the right of employing them. The great art of government is to make it possible for people to expand beyond what they can do in the state of nature. He says, again, nature and the earth furnished only almost worthless materials. So he says it is evident that though the things of nature are given in common, yet man being master of himself and proprietor of his own person, and the actions or labor of it, had still in himself the great foundations of property, and that which made up the great part of what he applied to the support or comfort of his being, when invention and arts had improved the conveniences of life, was perfectly his own, and did not belong in common to others. Locke points out that the great thing about money is that it's made out of something durable. People can make anything out of money, so they can even use grain or rice. They may use metal or rock, but they use something durable, something that will not spoil. So having money gets around the law against spoilage. You can heap up a lot of pebbles, and as long as you can protect them, you have not violated any law of spoilage, and you've traded something that will spoil, no doubt, for those pebbles, and so now you can keep them until you need something. Again, all of this in the state of nature still. And as soon as this happens, that money is invented and starts to get used, we will see some people able to obtain more of the earth than others. And he says this is by a tacit and voluntary consent that a man may possess more land than he himself can use the product of, and that men have agreed to a disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth, because that falls out from the economic activity that he's talking about. Now, the implications of this are that this economic activity all gets started in the state of nature, but it can only go so far, as I said, without more human organization, particularly without the power of government to enforce property rights. So when people start to get the ability to hire labor, the ability to enclose more acres than they could ever farm as an individual or as a small family, and when they get to the point of quite unequal shares of property, that's when government becomes necessary, he says, in order for there to be law enforcement, the enforcement of property rights, the enforcement of contracts. So that's why he sets it up at this point where, that's why early on he talks about property. I should back up and briefly say, Locke sees our first property as our own bodies. That's our first property. We own our own bodies. Then the bodies mix, using labor with the earth to create our first property. And so, again, he'll use this later on to basically argue any power that can take your property without your consent can take your primary property, your body, i.e. your life. All right, so we're setting it up. Next time we'll move on to chapter 6 and probably do at least 7 and 8 as well. All right, bye.